tonight to host a special advance preview of the Bible's Buried Secrets, which will be a 2-hour special on Nova that will premiere nationwide on November 18th at 8 p.m. on PBS, locally here on GBH. The most popular science series on television with 5 million viewers weekly, Nova, is produced right here in Boston in our own backyard, so to speak. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce the director, writer, and producer of the Bible's Buried Secrets, Gary Glassman. As president and executive producer of Providence Pictures, Inc., he has produced more than 30 programs in the past 10 years for Nova, PBS, Discovery Channel, the History Channel, and others through stunning photography, powerful narrative, inventive animation, and cinematic reenactment. His films translate complicated ideas into simple and compelling stories. For Nova, Secret of Photo 51, the story of Rosalind Franklin's role in the discovery of the structure of DNA, was a 2004 Emmy nominee for Outstanding Writing, and The Lost King of the Maya was a finalist at the International Archaeological Film Festival. Transistorized, a film he directed for PBS, won the 2001 Science Journalism Prize from the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Glassman, who received a Master's of Fine Arts in directing from UCLA, also produces innovative media art programs. His work is featured in the permanent collections of the Museum of Modern Art and the National Gallery and the Pompidou Center in Paris. We're in for a special and wonderful treat tonight as we preview a section of the Bible's Buried Secrets, and we'll also have a distinguished panel, including two of Harvard's own, Larry Steger and Jaya Cohen, whom Gary will more properly and fully introduce later. But now, please join me in welcoming Gary Glassman.
Thank you, Dudley, and thank you to the Harvard Divinity School for having this special screening tonight. The Bible's Buried Secret is a special Nova 2-hour presentation produced by Providence Pictures, and as mentioned earlier, the film premieres Tuesday, November 18th at 8 o'clock on PBS. I'm very pleased to share a preview with you tonight, and we look forward to the conversation after we see the clips. The focus of the film is the Hebrew Bible. Our goal was to gather the last 100 years of biblical archaeology and scholarship, including the most current research and discoveries, and forge it into a compelling, dramatic story. In doing so, the Bible's Buried Secrets tackles some of the most pressing questions in modern biblical studies. Where did the ancient Israelites come from? Who wrote the Bible? When and why? And how did the worship of one God, the foundation of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, emerge? The 25-minute clip you'll see tonight is a compilation of a few segments from the film. It begins with a prologue. Following that, you'll see an excerpt that explores the Exodus, one of the most referenced accounts in the Bible. You'll see a reenactment of the discovery of the oldest Hebrew alphabet at Tel Zayit, which dates back to the 10th century BC. We'll visit the site that the excavator claims to be King David's palace. We'll look for Solomon's temple, and we'll conclude with a little bit of animal sacrifice. In making the film, we traveled to sites throughout the Near East, Egypt, Israel, Jordan, and Syria, and interviewed dozens of archaeological and biblical scholars, over 20 of whom are in the film, each bringing his or her own unique perspective. I'm very pleased that the 4 participants tonight, all of whom are connected to Harvard, are joining us for questions following the clip. So now, please enjoy the preview.
God is dead. Or so it must have seemed to the ancestors of the Jews in 586 BC. Jerusalem and the temple to their God are in flames. The nation of Israel, founded by King David, is wiped out.
It would have seemed to have been the end, but it was rather the beginning.
For out of the crucible of destruction emerges a sacred book, the Bible, and an idea that will change the world, the belief in one God.
This is a new idea. It was an idea that nobody had ever had before.
Monotheism is well ensconced, so something major happened, which is very hard to trace.
Now, a provocative new story from discoveries deep within the earth and the Bible.
We wanted to examine the possibility that the remains of King David's palace are here.
We can actually see vivid evidence here of a destruction.
Question number one, who did it?
An archaeological detective story puzzles together clues to the mystery of who wrote the Bible, when, and why.
And it was very clear it was some kind of a tiny scroll.
I immediately saw very clear, very distinct letters.
This is the ancestor of the Hebrew script.
And from out of the earth emerge thousands of idols that suggest God had a wife.
We just found this exceptional clay figurine showing a fertility goddess.
Powerful evidence sheds new light on how one people, alone among ancient cultures, finally turned their back on idol worship to find their one God.
This makes the God of ancient Israel the universal God of the world that resonates with people, at least in Jewish, Christian, and Muslim tradition to this very day.
Now, science and scripture converge to create a powerful new story of an ancient people, God, and the Bible. Up next on Nova, the Bible's buried secrets.
We have Shia Cohen, professor of Hebrew literature and philosophy at Harvard University. Professor Lawrence Steger, professor of the Archaeology of Israel, Harvard University. We have Professor Joan Branham, who last year was the acting director of the Women's Studies and Religion program here at Harvard Divinity and is currently associate professor of art history at Providence College. And Tristan Baracco, the senior researcher at Providence Pictures and graduate of Harvard's Department of Near Eastern Religions. And not here is Peter Machinist, who you saw in the clip. He's on sabbatical at Oxford. In the interest of full disclosure, I must say I am married to one of the panelists. And if it weren't for her, I would still think the temple was the place I was bar mitzvahed in Buffalo. And every time anybody said sacred space, I'd still say far out. Anyway, what I'd like to do is start by asking each of our panelists about your involvement in the film, and then we can open it up for questions. And Joan, would you like to start?
Sure. Thank you. So my involvement, actually, Gary and I had talked about this as a project long before he ever suggested it to Nova, and so it just happened to resonate with the executive producer there, and that was a great match. And then, frankly, after that, I sort of stepped back, and the program took off. One of the things that I was involved with, I suppose, from the beginning, is just making sure that Gary was connected to the people he needed to be, since I was in a related field. And the main thing that was very interesting that came out of this, I contacted my colleagues here at Harvard. I also did my colleagues in Jerusalem, and independently and separately, they all suggested, as the associate producer, Tristan Baracco, who had just finished his PhD here at Harvard, and it was just a coincidence and wonderful moment that came together that Tristan was able to be in the field, completely trained in the area, and then he came on board. And so that was sort of just how that developed. The other thing I would just say that was interesting for me to see that evolved in this project was, again, sort of watching from the sidelines, was it started out with a very broad brush stroke and going into late antiquity. And as the project proceeded, it reminded me of how scholarly research proceeds. It began to get narrower and deeper into a more defined area, still being broad enough for the audience, but in fact the Second Temple period and even late antiquity basically just got cut out because there was a focus on trying to go to this earlier period and to give it space and time. The other thing I wanted to just mention that was great was that there was a convergence last semester here at HDS. I was teaching a course on ritual, gender, and space, and we were focusing on sacrifice. And it was at that time that the film began to ask about those questions as well. So it just happened to be another connection of the dots. So anyway, there's just my involvement.
Larry, would you like to?
Sure. I got in on the tail end of the project, although I have to say with full disclosure that Tristan was my very important graduate student here, and I was one of his advisors throughout, but I didn't advise him at all on this film, so I have a few issues to take with him over his interpretation, although on the whole he did a tremendous job, as I think the film, if I dare call it a film, the program shows.
You won't take back his PhD.
We won't take back his PhD, no. He actually did it on the Philistines, and they don't make much of an appearance in this particular project that I know of. So, hello. We had set up a few engagements, and then, I don't know, one was in Israel. We didn't quite make it the same time there, so finally at the tail end of this, we did some shooting in the museum where we had the display that much of the animated temple seems to come from. And we were sitting there amidst our Israelite house and discussing various issues that come up in the movie. So do I dare call it a movie? I should probably have a different term for it, Gary. What do you call it?
The movie sounds great.
All right. The Nova program. The documentary and docudrama.
Shia, would you like to say?
Gary approached me, I don't know how many years ago already, and we had some preliminary discussions about what could be done in a TV program, what should be done in a TV program, what he wanted to do in a TV program, and we bounced some ideas around for a while, I recall. And I recall reading some early scripts of the show, and in my usual friendly and supportive way, I made some comments about the script, and out came forth this movie. Right, and so my involvement, I don't think, was terribly formative, but I would like to think that I had something to contribute.
Well, one section that you'll have to see on November 18th is the transformation of Israelite cult to Jewish, the seeds of modern Judaism that takes place during the Babylonian exile, and Professor Cohen is very much central to that section in particular.
So I got involved about 2 years ago when I got an email from someone a lot of you probably know, Cy Gittin at the Albright, and he asked me if I was interested in working on a film project for Nova about biblical archaeology. And my first reaction was, sounds pretty interesting. And then I began to think, well, I've seen a lot of documentaries about the Bible and archaeology, and a lot of them are pretty awful. So I was a little bit wary, but then I met Gary, and he explained to me that because of the complexity and the breadth of the subject matter, he wanted to hire somebody who specialized in the field. So he took a chance and he hired me. I had absolutely no background in film production, but I did know quite a bit about biblical archaeology. I got my doctorate from Harvard here at NELC, and Larry Steger was my primary advisor. So for the past 2 years, my jobs have been to research the film, write it, edit the script, to work closely with the animators, with the art department, people who did the recreations, and with the web development team at WGBH to make sure that the film is as accurate as possible. I have to say that I was very impressed with some of the standards, both at Nova and Providence Pictures. For example, at Nova, I learned early on that they require, for the fact-checking, that for every statement of fact have 2 sources to back it up. I was also impressed when I realized that they were really going to listen to me. So every objection I raised, every comment I had, they listened. And even though this meant that there was rewrites, revisions, extended deadlines, increased budget, my comments were taken into account. So I guess you could say that if there are any errors in the film, I'm to blame. But ultimately, Larry advised me. He trained me, I should say. So I lay the blame ultimately at his feet.
Well done.
Well, we can open it up to questions from the audience, and I'm supposed to read this statement. This event is being audio and video recorded for broadcast on the WGBH Forum Network. We ask that you use the audience microphone when you ask questions so your thoughts will be included in the broadcast. Note that by coming up to the microphone, you are giving permission for your voice and image to be recorded and edited for broadcast on the web and via other media as determined by WGBH. Any questions?
Yes.
Gary, thank you for sharing this now. You really whetted my appetite, and I'm sure everybody in the room to see the full show on November 18th. I have a question for the panel, and I'd love to hear what people think. What do you think the audience is going to take away from this as the most surprising facts?
I'm not sure about facts, but this is the one thing that I think sometimes in the business I hear them talk about, reaching Trailer Park America or something like that. This notion of the Bible, void of any kinds of comparative data with material evidence. And so for me, this show foregrounds material evidence, archaeological evidence, in a way I haven't really seen done exactly like this. And I think that to me is going to raise the awareness of the audience of that material evidence as comparative data. So that's a general contribution.
Well, I know what I would hope they would come away from, but is it what TV shows are aimed at the average 12-year-old or something like or something like that? So I would like people to come away realizing that the Bible is not a transparent text, right? Its meaning does not lie on the surface. Its meaning must be excavated. The Bible is not a newspaper report. written by an eyewitness contemporary observer of events, or rather it's a literary narrative shaped by, in the course of transmission, by numerous hands over the course of time. The Bible does not, as a result, lose value, but the Bible becomes a very complicated document, and it's not a simple thing, as your preacher might suggest, about how to read it or how to interpret it. And last but not least, the realization that there is evidence out there, outside the Bible, which intersects here and there with the Bible, and when it does, it's always interesting to see that. I would hope that people could take away those things from the Bible, even if the specifics they may not find convincing or completely comprehensible.
I also hope they would take away these things, that the Bible is this very complex set of texts, and the identification of certain things in there with archaeology. It's said sometimes there's a convergence, but there's also a divergence, and I think that's brought out nicely in a lot of the issues that are addressed. But I'm not too hopeful for the vast audience that might be watching. Having seen so many of these really bad Bible shows that Tristan referred to, this will be a really good one. It may be slightly more sophisticated for the general audience than they can handle, having just gone through now 2 years of political campaigning and how these catchwords and things get boiled down to sound bites. You can see how some very simple things reach this audience and or these audiences, and I'm reminded of a course that was taught by a friend of mine at Boston College, and he was teaching a course on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and later he met one of his older students on the street, and she said, "Oh, Professor, I want to thank you so much for having taught me everything I know about the Deep Sea Scrolls." And so this is sometimes what even students will take away from our lectures and all. So I wouldn't guess that it's going to be a vast audience that receives all the nuances that are in this, because it's wonderful, I think, to have a nuanced production that doesn't just give you, this is the way it is and this is the way it conforms to text, or this is the way it conforms to the archaeology.
Oh, just very briefly, I just hope people who watch this documentary realize that the Bible was written for specific reasons at specific times, and it shouldn't just be read as a history textbook.
Kind of like Shakespeare.
Yes.
I would just add that you've got a lot of, Deaver said in this segment we saw that there's no word for history in the Bible. What you really get are collective memories, and they can include everything from what we might call history today to what others would call mythology or legend or all of these kinds of things. And that doesn't mean they're any less believable to the ancient inhabitants, that they might have occurred or not occurred, but it's not history in the modern sense, and we have to, I think, always keep that in mind. And as I've often said about cultures, even when they tell us lies, it's rather important for cultural history to know what stories they're telling us, and if they're true or not isn't always the main thing to judge them by. But collective memories include all of these various approaches to looking at their past.
Hi. I studied biblical archaeology at the University of Toronto, and when we reviewed the Merneptah Stela, we came under theories that it could also refer to a place, not necessarily a people. So with that in mind, what do you all say about the film showing one very specific interpretation of biblical archaeology and not discussing other theories? And a second question before I forget is, how is this film different from other popular biblical archaeological ones by Simcha Jakubovic?
Could I take the first one first and leave the next one to you experts who actually watch that other guy's films? I can't stand them myself. If you look at the Meneptah Stele, it has, and the little poem or victory ode in there about Ashkelon, Gezer, Yanoam that Donald Redford, the Egyptologist, mentioned, and Israel. These places that are Gezer, Ashkelon, Yanoam have the classifier or the determinative for a fortress or city-state. When you get to Israel, it has the people determinative. And with that, they're not talking about place, but they're talking about their identification as a tribal group. In other words, their location in society is through their genealogy and through who they look at as their founders or their eponymous ancestors, as they're called. The idea that this is a place name has been suggested by a very minority of scholars, most of whom are not Egyptologists. Most Egyptologists would admit or claim that the people determinative is that of a group, not necessarily nomadic. They could be in these villages, but not in a great fortified center, the way we know Ashkelon, Gezer, and Yanoam. Well, we don't know much about Yanoam, but we do know quite a bit about Gezer and Ashkelon, and they are not the same at all. Whereas the Israelites are up in the hills living in these little unwalled villages. They're pretty much the hillbillies, you might say, of ancient Canaan, whereas these lowlanders are more the urbanites. But the significant thing is not that they're fighting each other, that is Canaanite and Israelite, but here they're united in some ways against the Egyptians. And so this only reinforces whatever traditions they might have had about an exodus from Egypt. Here they've got Egyptians all around them claiming and ownership and domination of these groups in Canaan itself. So the rebellion in this case is Canaanite city-states plus Israelites against Meneptah, who always wins the battles when he records them, and so we don't know other than what he tells us of the outcome.
You really want an answer to that second question?
You may want to consult your legal department first.
Well, I think what we do in this film is that we like to say look beyond the fact or fiction. We're not interested in proving or disproving a particular story or trying to find scientific reasons for miracles that are recorded in the Bible. We're trying to understand it in a larger historical and social context and get meaning from that.
Hi, thank you. I was a little surprised when I came to Abraham and a discussion of monotheism that the impression that we got in the audience is that it's the same monotheism back in Abraham's time as we have it now, and look how great it is that, we have such a long tradition of monotheism. And there was no sense that, that the concept of God might have been very different, and henotheism and other gods existing side by side with Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. And I'm wondering if that was cut out for, just because it was too complicated, or maybe more for kind of PC reasons and getting everyone to, join in the same monotheistic devotion, so to speak.
Let's briefly say that you just saw just one scene that involves the development of the Israelite gods. So when you watch the whole 2 hours, you'll see that we do address this question of evolution from polytheism and even to henotheism down to monotheism.
Watch November 18th.
But I don't think it's right to claim monotheism with Abraham, who may be a fictive or legendary character to begin with. And I don't think that we should confuse monotheism with what the ancient Israelites, with their exceptionalism, believed, which wasn't that there were no gods, other gods existed. It was that they were generally powerless when compared with Yahweh. So it's Yahwism that you really need to compare with these other neighboring religions and religions of the great cultures. And some have referred to it as a monolatry rather than a monotheism, because that's really a theological, philosophical term that I wouldn't say applies in the Iron Age anyway.
I would simply make a very quick comment. The word monotheism is not a useful or helpful term. We're talking about ancient Judaism or ancient Christianity, because the term itself is a polemical term. It's not an ancient term. And the term itself needs to be defined at some length before it's useful, and therefore it's not useful. That's just simply an observation on language.
It also shouldn't be confused with iconoclasm or aniconism. I think a good case can be made, I don't know if it was made in the film or not, that one thing we don't find in archaeology after the Bronze Age, I think Stern might have made this in the full docudrama, that male figurines, either in metal or in clay of the deity, do not appear in any amounts, if at all, at Iron Age sites. This would seem to be a significant difference that you get in the archaeology of ancient Israel and neighboring cultures. I also, although we didn't have very much of it here, think that the issue of did God have a wife is a bit too, shall we say, rhetorical in expecting a yes answer when the evidence is not nearly as straightforward as what is shown with two inscriptions, one from a tomb and one from this site, this fortress Kuntilat-Ajrud, that mentions Yahweh and his Asherah. It's sometimes thought by some that Yahweh had a goddess as a consort, the mother goddess Asherah. 7th century, as representing Asherah because they have a cone-shaped bottom and the breasts are emphasized, but the cone is sometimes considered a tree trunk because Asherah was a tree goddess in some religions, doesn't hold up because it's a way of manufacturing these little clay figurines that you find in Cyprus, where there is very little, if any, Asherah, mother goddess, in the first millennium. And they're much more likely votives that women who were having babies offered to the deity, not necessarily a goddess, for lactating and having a good supply of milk for the child. I don't believe we can distinguish or recognize or identify those as specific goddesses in any repertoire we know of, pantheon in the first millennium.
also like to say thank you very much for both the film and the discussion so far. I would take just a small exception, Larry, with you. I take your point about the audience, but after serving now for a quarter of a century in churches, I'm convinced that there are many people out there who are eager to have good material that is reliable and reasonably sophisticated to look at. Gary was telling me, I don't know how many hits from Jesus to Christ, which was a similar kind of presentation, still gets on the Nova site. So I take the point, and certainly the discussions that we've had over the last 2 years in the political realm are disturbing, but I want to put a plug in for the people I serve. So.
I hope you're right. I unfortunately remember the people that I grew up with in rural Ohio, and I doubt if they're going to take to this too readily, because they know all the answers before you ask the question. So what is there to study, You can't really inquire if you're dealing with a fundamentalist.
I'm really looking forward to seeing the film, and I agree with Dudley. I think it's going to be great as an education of people. I'm a student. I come late here as a student, and I'm taking Michael Cogan's course, Hebrew Bible, and so it's fascinating to see this on film. Just some reactions, maybe some questions for you. The first is, where is the most confluence of history and legend? Which parts? Is it David, or where do we find it in the Bible where we have the most confluence of real fact and the literature of the Bible? The second is, it seems that there, from this class, I won't say exaggerations, but it's impossible that 600,000 people left Egypt. There's no record. I mean, it would mean 2 million people, which would be the population of Egypt, or the Chronicles of Joshua. It just doesn't. There's I would say, a tendency toward exaggeration. And how does this mesh with the Bible today? And the last thing I think I'm struck by is the persecution of war in this time, which is take no prisoners. It's absolutely appalling. I'm just wondering, I don't know, it's just an observation. I'll leave it with that.
I'll just briefly address the question about convergences, and then maybe others can elaborate. We deal with them quite a bit. And the first one occurs around 1200 with the Merneptah Stela. And you really don't get another one until the time of David, when he's mentioned in some extra-biblical texts. But you really can't talk about history in the Bible until you get into the 9th and into the 8th centuries, when Mesopotamian texts start to reflect on biblical events. And then it gets better and better from that point on. More and more historical is what I mean.
What about the artifacts? Are there archaeological things that converge? Is there one time when the archaeological evidence converges with biblical, a narrative?
Well, certainly the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians is well attested in archaeology, the Bible, and Babylonian text. So that's a really big one.
One of the best examples is Sennacherib's destruction in 701 of Lachish, where you have the iconography in his palace in Nineveh of the taking of Lachish. You have the excavations that show the siege ramp the Assyrians used to besiege the city, and the destruction of that is quite strong, quite evident within the town. And you have the rather amazing thing that this great army of Sennacherib somehow couldn't capture Jerusalem, or didn't, and yet Lachish became the prize, and that was the one that is highlighted in Nineveh. So there you have a very nice thing. You can actually triangulate on that one.
That one also is speaking what you said before, Larry, about divergence as well, because here we have this incredible archaeology and extra-biblical text around Lachish, and in the Bible it's basically mentioned in one line.
Yeah.
The king was here at Lachish, and they make a really big deal about Jerusalem. So once again, you see that the biblical writers were only really concerned with Jerusalem, and that's reflected in the writing.
This siege and destruction of Lachish is not in the 2-hour program, but you can see it as an extra scene on the Nova website and in the DVD.
Can I just pursue with another question? Is there any archaeological evidence of the bubonic plague or of anything of the army that was besieging Jerusalem?
No. No evidence of rats eating the bowstrings either. The Assyrians.
I'd like to comment briefly on the question about the cruelty. By modern standards, one could argue ancient wars are particularly cruel. By modern standards, one could argue ancient wars are not particularly cruel, insofar as modern technology has far more efficient means of killing people than any of the ancients did. Therefore, far more people get killed. Mass aerial bombing, for example, never happens in the ancient Near East. So one can argue that point. I would just make a slightly different point, which is that I think for fundamentalists, or those who believe that Scripture is a literal dictation from God to Moses and from Moses to pen and paper, then there are any number of passages that are very seriously troubling, or should be. Let's pick an obvious one, say Deuteronomy 7, right, where we have the command to wipe out the Canaanites. All 7 Canaanite nations are to be exterminated or devoted to God. And that's a motif that appears in some of the stories in Joshua and Judges and Samuel. Now, if you believe that this comes directly from God, or God commands the Israelites to wipe out the Canaanites, or God commands the Israelites to wipe out the Amalekites, then I would say you have a God then who's commanding, what shall we say, ethnic cleansing. I don't want to say genocide, but maybe it is. Something which should be very troubling to a thinking person. The issue is still troubling, but at least it's a little more comprehensible if we imagine that these are human beings writing, right, who are writing something which they thought they believed, rightly, wrongly, we can argue, of course, right? And if you understand, furthermore, that the text has a function, right, and the function of the text is as a way for the Israelites to say, we are not Canaanites. In fact, we hate Canaanites. In fact, we hate them so much we wish we could kill them. Because the fact is, as we know from archaeology, and as we know from biblical scholarship, the Israelites probably were Canaanites. The Israelites did not kill the Canaanites. On the contrary, they settled with them and they mingled with them, and they probably came out of Canaanites. So the rhetorical function of the text is a text to say, no, we're not Canaanites, we hate Canaanites, trust me, we don't want nothing to do with them. Right? That's the rhetorical function of the text. But what they write is still horrifying, what they write. But at least scholarship allows us to diffuse or defang some of that text by understanding its rhetorical function, something which otherwise, if you don't adopt this approach, then I challenge you to say, well, what kind of God do you think is going to give a command like that? This is a good example, I think, where biblical scholarship actually helps to defend or make sense out of biblical text, where a fundamentalist reading, I think, will require us to reject it.
So whenever you deal with narrative history, you've got to make choices. For the people who are intimately involved with making the film, as what were sort of some of the tough choices you had to make about what went into the film or didn't go into the film, or into the story, didn't go into the story. For those of you who are sort of less intimately involved, what choices do you wish had gone into the film or had not gone into the film, as it were?
I quickly answer that. My big scene where I jumped out of the helicopter, that didn't make it. I don't understand it. My big scene, that didn't make it.
very quickly, I spent about 3 years writing a dissertation on the Philistines, and that scene fell out.
Well, we are fortunate enough that some of the scenes that did not make it into the final film are on the DVD and also on the Nova website as bonus material, so you can access it, which is great, as well as extended interviews as well, because I mean we spoke to the best people in the field and had to edit them down to create the story. And so there are some extended interviews on the website.
Is that up already, Gary?
Much of it is up already, yes. So you can look, and over the next few weeks more will be added to that. But in terms of, again, in the very beginning we wanted to do 4 hours or 6 hours, and it got to a point, and there's plenty of material, but it got to a point where we had enough money to make 2 hours, and then we had to decide which 2 hours, and we thought the very beginning, because the origins and how the Bible, at least the first 5 books, are written, and the evolution of the concept of one God, or at least one God as the Israelites understood it at that time, was the very foundation of everything that comes afterwards. So we left open the possibility that we could do hours 3, 4, 5, 6, but in actuality, making the choice of doing this, we thought that's where the most interesting new scholarship was, and the most intriguing questions for us. And then, I mean, in terms of, we really want people to watch this, and the key to getting people to watch is putting all that material into a dramatic story. I mean, it has a beginning, middle, and end, and if you watch it, you'll see a development, and becomes very satisfying. I mean, one of the things when we first started talking to our scholars, some advised, don't even talk about the documentary hypothesis. Don't look at the biblical writers. It's going to be boring. Nobody's going to be interested. But in fact, we decided to really tackle that and try to contextualize them in certain time periods and places, and associate those writers with specific passages in the Bible, and follow them all the way to the Babylonian exile, where the premise of our film is that this is where the 5 books of the Bible as we know it today are created, based on scrolls that had been written over hundreds of years. So that was a choice that we wanted the weaving of the writing of the Hebrew Bible to tie the whole story together.
And I just want to add, I know when you guys were struggling with that whole section, because obviously to get into biblical scholarship is in depth is going to be very difficult for the popular audience. But the thing that filmmakers can do sometimes is, for example, those animations with the text and the pieces of the text going in and out and that sort of thing, was to try to transform a whole field, frankly, in scholarship to some visual motif, and that can be understood by an audience without any training at all. So those are, I have to say, I think some of the successful parts of the film.
We wanted to, actually the Bible itself is a physical thing. We had it constructed, and it is filmed in traditional stop frame animation. And part of that was that we really wanted to convey a reverence for the book itself, and that we ourselves wanted to engage with the book and the material, and we wanted to convey to the audience at some very primal level that this is something that's touched and dealt with. And our animators, for instance, who are wonderful. They brought in their family Bibles, and we looked at a lot of different kinds of Bibles, and we tried to, we thought at one point that we wanted to find the perfect Bible that we could just use so it would just look stylistically cohesive. Then we decided, well, why not the best of the Bibles? Because, the stories from the Bible have inspired the greatest artists of all times to depict those stories, Caravaggio and Rembrandt and Michelangelo. So why not, utilize them? So we constructed that Bible and spilled coffee over it to make it look like it was used. And, so.
I just want to second what Gary said earlier, because I jotted down a note to myself when I saw this at home, the full-length version. Nova does a fine job explaining a very difficult and usually boring topic, the documentary hypothesis. So it was well done. I could also add that since this was made, there's a very exciting discovery that's been made in a hill overlooking the valley of Elah, where David and Goliath supposedly fought their battle. And it's a fortified settlement or a fortress, I should say, with a gate, city gate, and it has some ashlar masonry in it, and it goes all the way back to 1000 BCE. I would put the Tapi Zayat thing closer to 900, the latter half of the 10th century. But now they have within that fortress a 5-line ostraconer letter painted on a potsherd that seems to be an old Canaanite or a very early Hebrew. We're in Judahite territory there, probably not Philistia, but Judah. And so this, I think, adds another piece. That's the great thing about archaeology. It's a cumulative thing, and, sometimes you make too grand a hypothesis on one bit of data, and you'll find a whole bunch of it coming forth, and the other that contradicts it. Sometimes you'll find that it supports what you've already said. So I would say this is very good support for the line you were taking in the documentary.
I was interested to learn that no archaeological evidence has been found to support the notion of the recording of the mass exodus. What kinds of evidence, what kinds of artifacts could be discovered that would affirm that?
Well, in the film, our scholars talk about there's no evidence in Egypt for a loss of that kind of population. It would have represented a third of the population of Egypt at that time, and it certainly, even if they wouldn't admit that all these people left, there certainly would have been some kind of economic crisis in the country that we would have found evidence of textually. And then just in terms of the archaeology, they've just never, ever found anything anywhere in the Sinai that shows any kind of migration like that. What I am particularly proud of in the film, though, is that we do ask why does the story still resonate today, and why does the story actually become so important to the Israelites? Because they write about it over and over, and all four different writers, groups of writers, write about it. And you'll have to, again, watch November 18th, but the idea is that it becomes a story that helps create a national identity around this new sort of egalitarian society that emerges with the collapse of Canaanite society. And that's the sort of the simple answer to that. But you can watch the film, but somebody else might have more to say about it.
You have to go about it in a fairly indirect way. One of the tangential things that we have is to look at the group into which Moses, the Moses story, has Moses marrying a Shiksa, a daughter of Jethro, and the Midianites. And so you have archaeological evidence for Midianites in the northwest part of Arabia. You have evidence of them all the way up to the great copper mines at Ain Nahash, and some evidence of trade. These were great traders and caravaneers. And in the earliest material, the Midianites are considered friendly people. Then by the time of Gideon, they become the enemy. So these things change according to the story and so forth. But we do have some archaeological evidence that links them with Midianites, these Kenites that may be involved in metallurgy, and it is possibly, and that's also this region that is in the documentary from which the Shasu have a land called Yahweh as a place name rather than as a deity, presumably. So if you have those little bits and pieces that suggest there's something going on of a group, perhaps coming from Egypt, but up through that region, not through the Sinai that we know today primarily, but more into the northwest Arabia and up through that channel into what becomes Edom and Moab. And in the earliest period, it's poems, if you believe there are early poems. This is also one of the treks that Yahweh takes from Seir and Edom and so forth as he leads them eventually into the Promised Land.
Speaking of that group, do you deal at all with the notion of Aten and the notion of the one God jumping the water and coming up through the Kenites?
No, we don't deal with that in the film.
That's the prequel, isn't it?
Right.
Maybe.
Yahweh the early years.
Hi, I was just wondering if there were any scholars who don't necessarily reject the documentary hypothesis, but have maybe another hypothesis as to why there are different uses for or names for God, or and also do you think there's an approach to the Bible that is beneficial other than a historical approach?
I'll start. Two very good questions. The first point is that very, very many very, very smart people for a very long time, read the Bible as carefully as we, and that is an understatement, and they did not notice that the Bible, by which we mean the Torah, that's a confusion in the film, right? They mean the Torah, the first 5 books. They did not think, notice, or believe that the first 5 books of the Torah, of the Bible, were somehow a composite authorship, right? They thought that the book was entirely unitary. So all the problems that modern scholars see and solve by appeal to a documentary hypothesis, they saw and they were able to solve by other means. Now, some of those means, looking at what they wrote, we understand that these are counsels of desperation, these are not very plausible, etc., etc. However, having said that, we need to confess that modern scholarship in its documentary hypothesis does not always solve all the problems either, and it also does not always solve them very elegantly. For example, I, for one, am not entirely convinced that the flood story was created by somebody who sat at his desk and cut little snippets of paper and then glued them together on the page, which strikes me as a very odd way for any ancient author to proceed. So I'm not entirely convinced by that. So one approach is that there is a very rich tradition of Bible scholarship. It's not modern, it's not academic, right? You won't get tenure if you believe in it, right? But which has a very, very long and history in both Jews and Christians alike in reading Scripture. And we need to take that kind of scholarship seriously, even if, in the end of the day, we may not always find it entirely convincing. Okay, let's stop it.
Anybody else want to answer that? Otherwise, we have time for maybe one more question.
Well, let's ask the question. Is there another approach?
Well, the answer is, of course, there are numerous approaches, right? By historical, do you mean how did the biblical text come to be? Well, ultimately, I'll give my own personal response. My own personal response would be to say, if you believe the Bible comes from God, then of course the Bible speaks with authority unlike that of any other book. If you think the Bible comes from God but mediated by humans, and you're willing to leave open the question of how that's supposed to work exactly, then the authority of the Bible is more akin to that of other, quote, great works. Now, here we can argue, is the authority of the Bible greater than that of Chaucer, or greater than that of the Iliad, or greater than that of Oedipus Rex, or greater than that of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight? We could argue the point, and etc. But then we're reading it with a different lens completely, because we're no longer saying that it is other, that it is completely unlike any other book. Right? The fundamental point is that one. Is it unlike any other book, or is it indeed like other books? Once you get over that divide, then we can continue to talk. But that's, to my mind, the fundamental point.
There's a very interesting book called The Past is a Distant Country. And when you look at, let's say, the Hebrew Bible and try to put it into its original context, if you can, it does seem like a fairly alien document to us because we've had a whole succession of interpretation and stories about the Bible, some of which may resonate with that past, and some of it is quite a distance from it. And a professor, priest friend, and I wrote a book called Life in Biblical Israel. We tried to look at it as a distant country. But now Professor King has written another book in which he calls it, The Bible is for Living, a Scholar's Spiritual Journey. Totally different kind of book and use of the Bible than we did in trying to reconstruct what life might have been like from it through archaeology in the Iron Age. So that shows you at least some people. I'm not necessarily capable of that, but he is capable of looking at it, as you say, through very different lenses.
Well, I would say the Bible is big enough, strong enough, that it can sustain numerous different ways of reading all at the same time. Right? Different readers will read the same text and get different things out of it, and that is fine.
And I would say from a filmmaker's perspective, my directing teacher used to tell me that good directors steal good ideas, but great directors steal great ideas. And the testament to the Bible is that those stories that are in there continue to resonate today, and we still grapple with them, and we still look to the Bible for, really basic ideas of how to treat one another and how to, be in the world and leave it a better place. And so, in that sense, it's better than King Arthur. You can judge it a little better than King Arthur in that sense. Any other questions, or is that?
I just wanted to say, I hope when they open the envelopes that Bible's Buried Secrets will be awarded the Emmy.
Well, thank you. I'll just encourage you all to go to the website for more information, and again, watch it on November 18th. We've got some flyers there at the door if you want to pre-order your DVD at a special discount rate. Thank you.